Welcome, everyone, to the pilot episode of Buckeye Sports Breakdown, a show about sports teams from the great state of Ohio. I'm your Hirson Hassan. Thanks for joining me this Wednesday morning. It's Thanksgiving weekend, and there's a lot to be thankful for in the Buckeye State as the Cincinnati Bearcats, Xavier Musketeers, and Ohio State Buckeyes face off in big college basketball tournaments. The Bengals continue their push for a playoff spot as they square off in a rematch of last year's divisional game against the Titans, and the Browns will hold on to their remaining playoff hopes against Tom Brady and the Buccaneers. Last but certainly not least, the Ohio State Buckeyes football team faced the familiar foe known as the Michigan Wolverines, also known as the team up north. But first, time for my quick hits. Yesterday, the Miami Redhawks clinched a spot in the Bahamas Bowl with an 18-17 win over Northern Illinois. Except for Akron, all the MAC teams from Ohio are bowl eligible. Also, if the playoffs started today, the conference championship would also be in state as the Ohio Bobcats would face the Toledo Rockets to decide who wins the MAC. It would be the first conference championship featuring two teams from Ohio since 2017 when Toledo beat Akron 45-28. The UC Bearcats football team hosts Tulane on Friday in a pivotal AAC matchup. Both teams are currently atop the standings, and the winner will host the AAC championship next weekend. The Bearcats, with the win, will head to the championship game for the fourth consecutive year. And finally, the University of Dayton Flyers start off their campaign at the Battle for Atlantis tournament today against Wisconsin at 12:30 Mountain Standard Time, 2:30 out on the East Coast. The Flyers entered 3-1 with the loss on the road to UNLV being their only loss of the year so far. They could end up facing Kansas tomorrow if they pull off the win and could face Tennessee or USC in the championship if they make it to that point. I just checked in on Kansas and NC State. Pretty close battle. So, nonetheless, number 3 Kansas in a tight battle. UD could face them off tomorrow, or it could be NC State, barring they get a win against Wisconsin. So let's go back to the big topics, starting off with college basketball as we head out to Maui, where the Bearcats and the Buckeyes are taking part in the Maui Gym Invitational this weekend and actually played yesterday with Ohio State winning 78-53. It was an interesting matchup. Of course, early on, it was quite cagey and quite close early on, and then Ohio State started to find a groove. Was basically big and physical against UC and outclassed them in that regard. Let's take a look at the losers of that battle, the UC Bearcats. As I noted, they seemed off balance in that. You have to give credit to their big man, though, against Ohio State. Everybody else, though, seemed very rough, at least in terms on how that game ended out in that fashion. It went from a 2-point game to a 22-point game in the course of 15 minutes. It's quite interesting, like how UC just shifted from that regards of how they played against Arizona out on Monday, 50% three-point shooting, although Arizona ended up shooting nearly 80% in the second half. And another point that the commentators made during the broadcast was the fact that UC never got that many assists. In fact, they only had 4. The leading assist scorer for Ohio State, Isaiah Likely, had 4 assists. That, I think, tells you how messed up, or rather how just kind of stagnant that seemed for the Bearcats that day. There were some questions about their consistency as well. They do have a chance to right the ship today at 5:30 Mountain Standard Time as they play Louisville in their final matchup of this Maui Gym Invitational. Louisville, of course, I think right now many people could agree with me by saying Louisville is probably the worst Power 5 team right now in college basketball. They're 0-5. They've dropped a lot of bye games. And I just checked yesterday the projections. UC is favored to win by like 78%. It's pretty big. It's a no-brainer there. So just looking at that, you have a loss to Arizona, number 14 in the championship. They're going to the championship. They're facing Creighton today. You have a loss to Ohio State. Louisville, I mean, right now, Louisville does not look like a March Madness team. So even if they do go 1-2, this is still a rough situation and a rough transition for Wes Miller and the Bearcats. Of course, just trying to pick up the pieces. You know, I saw on Twitter yesterday the fact that some UC fans were saying that John Brandon basically screwed the program over, and now it's Wes Miller trying to pick up the pieces. And in doing so, you kind of do get these examples, kind of what we saw this week with UC. They face off against Arizona, but Arizona goes wild on offense. And same goes to Ohio State, where UC just got outclassed and they couldn't stop Ohio State and they couldn't get their offense, especially their three-point shooting, past the Buckeyes. So they'll be looking to get something going. Big matchup December 10th as they do host Xavier at Fifth Third Arena. Let's take a look at the victor of that competition, the Ohio State Buckeyes. This was a rebound for them too, the 81-53 win. It was a statement win. Physicality was back, and the big man Zed Key was a big part of it with 19 points after only having 7 versus San Diego State. The Buckeyes lost that game to the Aztecs 88-77 the day before they played the Bearcats. So, of course, I think for me, when I looked at this comparison, the offenses look very similar. I think with Ohio State, the difference came on the defense as they really showed up, and especially in those big moments, they showed up and they're really interested in how they can become that team. OSU didn't make March Madness. There were no Ohio teams that made March Madness, period, last year. So I think Ohio State right now currently ranked at number 7 in the bracketology. This is an interesting step for them. You take a hit against San Diego State, but you're coming back with that kind of firepower, and it shows. Only 6 turnovers in the game against UC compared to the Bearcats 14. UC also only went 22.2% from behind the arc instead of San Diego State's 47.6%. So, of course, the defense showed up, and they would need for it to show up, especially later today at 12:30 Mountain Standard Time. They will play Texas Tech, currently ranked number 21, according to the NCAA. As I mentioned, this is a game for Ohio State. If they want to prove they can get into the top 25 and be a perennial powerhouse, which, in my opinion, they haven't been in a while. I mean, I would have to say maybe 10 years ago when Tad Matta was part of that team and led them to the Final Four, where Ohio State was really a big competitive school. If they can get that win against Texas Tech, I think people will start paying attention to Ohio State a little bit more. And I think it also shows with their schedule coming up later. They've got Duke next week, and then they've got UNC, currently ranked number 1 in the nation. It's some big games that Ohio State, if they want to get to that next stage, not just to make it back, but maybe when you're looking at later on, Purdue, Illinois, there's some pretty darn good teams in the Big Ten. Indiana, for example, that Xavier played last week. Pretty darn good teams. But when you look at how Ohio State has been playing, these are the types of games that say, you know what, maybe Ohio State is a Big Ten contender when you look at it. Let's take a look now at Texas Tech, as they've had 70 points on average this year. They did beat Louisville by 32 yesterday, but lost to Creighton by 11 to start off the Maui Jim Invitational. Not as offensive, which kind of helps out the Buckeyes, knowing they faced that against San Diego State, but it will especially be the case in the paint as Texas Tech just ate Louisville alive there yesterday. And now let's take a look at the Xavier Musketeers. Tough loss at home to Indiana, number 12. And it's one of the things I like about the Gavitt Classic and that invitational is the fact that you have these two teams, Big Ten against Big East. Right after Xavier and Indiana played, you had Villanova against Michigan State. Pretty good perennial powerhouses. And with the Muskies too, I think very similar to UC, you have the standard kind of dropped over time when Chris Mack left for Travis Steele, and now Sean Miller, with all of his experience, is bringing it back. But boy, oh boy, I will say this. I grew up 30 minutes from Cintas Center, and I'd never been to a game at Cintas. Did my graduation there. But I will say this, though. Cintas Center, at its best, is electric. And I think for the first time since Xavier was playing, and it was a close battle. Those games back in like 2016, 2017. It felt like one of those games when I was watching it. I was like, wow, this is something. Even in November, the Muskies are able to do this and take a team that's right now number 12 in the nation to the end. And sure, you have to give credit. I mean, Indiana had a classic offensive game. I mean, it was a true performance. They shot over 60% from just overall in the shots. And then, of course, their big man, uh, had 30 points, Trace Jackson Davis, but I think what we're starting to see here, and I think someone mentioned it too, like if this was Travis Steele, Indiana's running away with it. Instead, it ended up being a close game when you look at guys like Kobe Jones, Zach Fremantle, Jack Nungy. Those are the guys that were brought in with upperclassmen experiences and with especially, these blue bloods and veterans like Trevon Blewett gone and Edmund Sumner. These are the guys in charge of Xavier now. And I think when you look at how Xavier played in that game, it shows they're making a step in the right direction. They're making a step back towards March Madness, which is where they're at, according to bracketology. So it's surely interesting. They will take part in the PK80 tournament. Their first game will be tomorrow, 3:30 Mountain Standard Time, 5:30 out on the East Coast against Florida. As I mentioned, I mean, two teams going back and forth, Xavier and Florida, two teams that were out of the picture in last year's March Madness, actually played each other in the second round of the NIT. Xavier won 72-56 on their way to a title there. But you look at the people in this tournament, it's pretty awesome. I think more than Maui Jim, which no disrespect, still a good tournament. This is going to be the tournament of Thanksgiving weekend. In fact, the winner of this game will play Duke. The final could be against Gonzaga. The fact that Xavier, I think, can even put this idea up on a totem pole, I think is pretty good. Just getting this idea, getting their feet wet in what this true competition looks like, something they haven't experienced since I would say maybe 2018 when they were the number one seed, or in my regards, when you look at the teams like Duke and Gonzaga, maybe even 2017 when Xavier beat Arizona at the time, coached by Sean Miller, and then ended up losing to Gonzaga in the Elite Eight. Big game and big tournament for Xavier up there at the PK80 tournament. So, of course, obviously a lot of options to improve the resume. And it's the case throughout for Xavier, Ohio State, and UC as they hope to get back to March Madness after missing out last year. We'll take a quick break, and coming up, we'll talk about the Bengals, Browns, and the biggest game in the state of Ohio, the game right after this. Welcome back to Buckeye Sports Breakdown, my show about everything based on the Buckeye State, also known as Ohio. And we talked about college basketball earlier on. Now let's take a look at football, starting off with NFL and the Cincinnati Bengals as they picked up a win 37-30 over the Steelers. Joe Burrow said actually after the game that it was one of the biggest wins he's had as a Bengal. It was a win without your big players. Of course, Jamar Chase has been out for a few weeks now. Joe Mixon went out with a concussion. But still, you have to give credit to Samaje Perine, who played in the middle, had a great day himself, 30 yards, ended up getting 2 touchdowns, at least as a receiver. T. Higgins has really been showing up as well. 9 catches for 148 yards in that game. And I think I want to focus on this too, just how the fact Zach Taylor is getting the ball out, and we're starting to see some new guys involved too. Trenton Irwin, 3 catches, 42 yards, and his first ever NFL touchdown. What a day for him. And, as a Bengals fan myself, people have been talking about the fact, oh, Jamar Chase is not there. You don't have these big name guys, but you think about it, Perine is not playing soft. People remember in the Super Bowl where he went 3rd down and 1 and he got stuffed, and everybody's saying, Mixon should have taken that carry. Overall, I have to say Samaje Perine has gotten so much better at being a bully runner, especially in the middle, as he still had his struggles. I think in general, though, this helps with 2 yards and 3 touchdowns in that game against Pittsburgh. Just looking at some of the stats, let's go back to the last time the Bengals played the Titans. In that game, Joe Mixon, in my opinion, was the best player on the field. He ended up having a rushing touchdown, 54 yards. But another thing I want to mention too, he also had 6 catches for 51 yards, being that kind of engine guy. And Piron, I think, in sense, being a pseudo Giovanni Bernard in some cases, just kind of, putting his foot forward, putting his way, kind of just bull running sometimes, but also pass catching, dancing on the ball. He's been that guy to go get some big yards for the Bengals. And I think, in a game, let's say if Joe Mixon is out, there is no consideration. There's been no ruling yet on whether or not Mixon will be out with a concussion. But I think even if Mixon does play, limited snaps or not, I think Taylor has to consider what Samaje Perine must do, especially in the pass catching game, especially with Jamar Chase out. He's been starting to rely on these other guys too, pass catching backs that can kind of burst up the field, not necessarily kind of put some stuff back. T. Higgins is still a good wide receiver, granted, but I think especially just giving some relaxation. Everybody knows what the Bengals receiving core is like, but the fact that Tyler Boyd only had 2 catches and 42 yards and Pirine was the one kind of being the engine says something about this Bengals team. Granted, Tennessee Titans are not the Pittsburgh Steelers, but that's still a pretty good result in my book. Let's take a look at the Tennessee Titans. Of course, just looking before that, let's take a look at the playoffs. Let's not forget about that. Bengals are currently ranked at the 7th seed, 6-4 on the year. They win a tiebreak over the Jets based on their win over them earlier this year. Titans are currently number 1 in the AFC South, number 3 overall in the AFC, currently 7-3. Ravens are 7-3 at 4. So once again, we're going back and forth between the Bengals and Ravens. Granted, I think the Ravens would still have the advantage just off of that head-to-head percentage since the Ravens did win that. But overall, I still have to give some credit to the Bengals. If they win, 7-4 puts them in a really good position to be a wild card. You look at their schedule later on this year. All of the teams they will be facing, save for the Browns, are teams that are right now in playoff spots. That is insane to think about. But think about it, though. Chiefs after this. Titans on Sunday. Browns, of course. Bucks that are currently kind of vying for that spot. They're right now 4th in the NFC. After that, Pats on the road. That's going to be a big one on Christmas Eve. Pats are currently number 6. After that, Bills at home. They're number 5. And then after that, the Ravens at home to wrap out the year. This is the start of a big, big stretch for the Bengals. And in my opinion, they need to go 4-3 to at least have a say in getting a playoff spot. If they go 5-2, they get a win. But the fact that you face the Chiefs again, best team in the AFC, and the Bills, those are some tough games, even at home. So I think for the Bengals, all in all, big, big game for them, and they need to get a win in Tennessee, especially the fact that the Titans have changed a little bit too since A.J. Brown has left. Brown had 5 catches, 142 yards, and a touchdown in that game. Let's take a look at the other team in Ohio, the Cleveland Browns. Not looking too good for them, 3-7, 13th in the AFC. Only teams worse than them, the Broncos, Steelers, and Texans. They will face off against the Bucks, who had a pretty interesting win against the Seahawks, and then they had their bye. So we haven't seen much about Tom Brady and the Bucks, but knowing Tom Brady and his resilience, we know this team's going to get better. So it's going to be an interesting battle. If the Browns pull it off, that's pretty good of them. And I think it says something too about this stretch of time without Deshaun Watson. This will be Jacoby Brissett's last game at the helm, most likely, as Deshaun Watson will take over next week. And overall, I have to say, for being a caretaker quarterback, pretty good overall. 2,398 yards, 11 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, QBR 62.4, which is actually 6th in the NFL. And it says something about Brissett, too, and just how he's carried this team overall compared to how he's done it before. Taking a look at his past years where he's been like a caretaker / starter, I'm looking at 2017 and 2019 with the Colts. And 2017, in 16 games, he had 3,098 yards, 13 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. 2019, you had, I believe, 2,942 yards, 18 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. Decent seasons, but the fact that Brissett has put up 2,398 in 10 games says something. Do the math. He could put up about 100 yards per game for the next 6 games, hypothetically, and still break his passing yard record from 2019 and 2017 when he was with the Colts. That says something, too, about Brissett using his weapons and being what it means to be a caretaker, too, and just I think with all the different moving parts in the NFL, it seems like there always seems to be a team that is having a quarterback discussion or trying to do something going on. Sorry about that. And I think when you do that stuff, I think that's what makes Jacoby Brissett special. And I think that's what I think could get him a starting job somewhere else if need be. So, talk Bengals, we talk Browns. Now let's talk about the game. Michigan against Ohio State, the oldest rivalry in college football, oldest rivalry in football, or one of the oldest at least, but still, it's old and it's a classic. Ohio State goes into this number 2, Michigan number 3. We saw the college football playoff rankings last week, especially with Tennessee losing. LSU has now been moved up to number 5, which basically solidifies the fact that the loser of this game is done in terms of their playoff chances. And they're not going to the Big Ten championship in that regards, too. So, in sense, this is the playoff game before the playoff game, which makes this even bigger. Sure, Ohio State has struggled on the road. Penn State only beaten by 2 possessions. Northwestern in an absolute winter storm, or it looked bad. Only a 14-point win. Against Maryland, 13 points. So it's going to be close. It is going to be a really close game. Ohio State does have the advantage being at home, and the shoe has treated them well over the years, especially against Michigan. But let's not count out 2016 when Ohio State won that thriller in double overtime. It was a gritty squad. And I think it's the same this year, where it's the same last year, too, where we saw Ohio State being that team, but in sense, never getting that much competition. And now you get the big moment, right? Sure, they beat Notre Dame at home in what was a cagey matchup. You beat Penn State in Happy Valley, but in the eyes of the college takes it. And I think in general, knowing how the SEC championship may play out could decide if Ohio State maybe gets the number 1 seed, something they have not gotten in their many years of going to the college football playoff. Looking at the game itself, let's take a look at Michigan and especially at the running backs core, because boy, oh boy, that has a big question mark on it. Blake Corum suffered an injury against Illinois, and it really hindered the team, as that was a close matchup. Thankfully for Michigan, ended up getting a game-winning field goal to win that one 19-17. But it was leaked by a Michigan tackle, I won't say his name, that he would be out and everybody else would have to step up in that regards. It would have to be a major step up. 1,457 rushing yards, 4th in FBS, 19 touchdowns in the year. It's tied for 1st. And for Jim Harbaugh and crew, it's going to be the case on who can step up. Next man up, basically, as the Wolverines rush for 243.8 yards per game, which is 4th in FBS. Pretty big numbers, pretty big impact if Corum is out. Also to note, Donovan Edwards, the pseudo backup for Michigan, did not play against Illinois. So Michigan could be without their top 2 running backs in that game. Again, insane, absolutely insane to think about in a game like this, where Michigan's trying to go back-to-back against Ohio State. Sure, they've had that advantage over the years, but fresh off that winning in the Big House last year, they're trying to make a statement, and I think just trying to make it back to the playoffs too, and show, you know what, Ohio State, you're not the man in charge here. I got some say too. And for Ohio State, this is that statement game to say, no, I'm still the man in charge. That was a fluke last year. So taking a look at that squad right here in 2022, it starts off with CJ Stroud, who looked lost in the Big House last year. And in turn, he's been confident, hasn't put up that many passing yards compared to what he's done last year, but overall, he's been much more accurate, much more patience for him. And I think, in my opinion, when you look at the Heisman race, which right now I think is kind of between him and Caleb Williams of USC. By the way, another great quarterback, saw him play when Arizona State played at LA Memorial Coliseum earlier this year. But nonetheless, when you look at CJ Stroud, 991 yards, 35 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. Pretty good on the year, and he's pretty accurate as well. The goal for him is how can he elude that Michigan defense, get out and get some threats down the field. We look at, say, some guys, Marvin Harrison Jr., 1,037 yards, Emeka Ibuka, 914 yards. on the year, both of them averaging 16 yards a catch. I think, in my opinion, Ohio State has loved to play that deep game, and especially at the big house, too. I mean, Ohio State fans over the years know that the Buckeyes love to do that. They love to air the ball out and they love to get it down the field. And I think if OSU can do that, especially against a Michigan side that offensively is kind of lacking, it may be a little bit of a shootout, but I think OSU at home will get the job done. I think they win, let's say 45-31. It's going to be a great day at the big house. 51 degrees and cloudy will be your high in Columbus as the Buckeyes look to make it back to the Big Ten championship after missing out last year and keep their spot in the college football playoff. That is it for this pilot of Buckeye Sports Breakdown. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. And once again, I'm Mahir Hassan. So long and stay safe.